shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
I've been doing a lot of traveling back and forth from the United Kingdom over to the Seattle area. This is now coming up. When this podcast drops, I'll actually be back in the States. This is my third trip in as many months. As I've mentioned before, my wife has basically quit her job to go care for her father, who is struggling with a brain tumor right now in the Seattle area. So I've been going back and forth, jet setting across, flying over the pond every few weeks and staying for longer and longer periods of time. And one of the things that's really come out of it that's really good is that on the first two trips I was over there, we were able to have a Seattle area Evangelical gathering. This, of course, is part of the Evangelical Facebook group that I've mentioned many times on this podcast before. And a friend of mine that I went to Bible college with, I mentioned this last week at the end of the episode with Steve Stone Sr., Brian Staples, he was one of the first ones who responded to my post about, I just wanted to see if people wanted to get together. I had no idea if there'd be anybody there, but Brian came out all the way from Gig Harbor, Washington, which is a long drive. He's actually just below Gig Harbor. That's a long drive, but they came out with his whole family, actually. And now we've had another gathering, and I think when this episode drops, I'm going to be back over there. We're going to try to get together yet again and see if we can get some more people to come out. But we had a great time talking, and right away I realized Brian's story is just an amazing one. We need to do a podcast with Brian. And so the second trip I was there, we met in Tacoma, which is just south of Seattle, at a friend's house. In fact, it was Jeff and Karen Green who were on this podcast last year talking about Jeff's struggle battling leukemia. And I was down there doing some work in Tacoma. And so Brian and I met. We met up. He came down after work, and we had a really great conversation. So I'm bringing you today part one with Brian Staples. And basically, it's just his story of his backstory, his upbringing. And he's going to talk about the crazy kind of cult-like church that he grew up in and his experiences at Bible college. And then we're going to get into next week a little bit more of his own deconstruction. And we talk about what that looks like. And I think this is a helpful conversation because I know that doing the podcast this way is not the way to build a big audience. I don't necessarily try to go after big names or Christian celebrities. I've never had Rob Bell or any of those other people on this podcast. I guess I wouldn't be against having Rob Bell on here, but to me, I want to build it this way. It's a slow way to build the audience, but I just want to talk to real people who are coming out of the real world, who have the real stories to share. And that's basically what Brian and I are going to get into this week and next. And I think what's really interesting about the whole experience of guys like Brian and his wife Krista as well, we're going to talk about her story a little bit too, and how that involves Brian's own deconstruction, is that there's a lot of levels to this thing, that when you deconstruct your former Christian faith, your whole worldview really changes. The whole thing starts to adapt and change, and you realize that your Christian faith actually doesn't stand up to some real serious scrutiny. And I think a lot of evangelicals out there and fundamentalists are living with a level of cognitive dissonance. They may not necessarily realize it or see it that way, but when you come out of it, when you start to look back on the kind of faith you were living with and the kind of faith that you were not just living with, but even supporting, upholding. I mean, I was a pastor. I was a teacher for 8 years. I was a pastor before that for 12 years in the Portland, Oregon area. And I firmly believed these things. I went to seminary, Bible college. I did a PhD. I was a teacher, as I say. I taught this stuff. I taught Bible theology. Now, as I've said before, I look back and I say, who the hell was that guy? I don't even know who that guy was, but I know that I'm becoming something completely different than what I was. So I'm glad that you're joining me on this journey of deconstruction and discovery. And as I've said before, it's when you start to deconstruct, especially if you're like me coming out of a former Christian faith, that you begin to engage this process of discovery. Where you go with it, I have no idea. I've discovered for sure, and I mentioned this before, that, as I say, deconstruction looks different for every person. And we all go to different places, and we don't always necessarily stay there. I've identified a spectrum of possible responses, and I'm up to 13 possibilities so far, and I'm adding more all the time as I get more feedback from people. And that's the thing, is there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. There's no right position. There's no wrong position. It's just, where are you going? Where are you heading? One thing is for sure, the things that we used to believe, we don't really believe them anymore. And so that's really what this is all about. This is Mind Shift Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I'm glad that you're joining me today for part 1 with Brian Staples. I hope you come back next week for part 2. We're going to get into stuff about the president, Donald Trump, the evangelical support for him, and how that relates to this whole question of deconstructing Christianity. Right now, as I'm doing this recording, there's a huge amount of controversy and flap over the Attorney General Jeff Sessions in the United States making some remark the other day about quoting the book of Romans to cite or justify Donald Trump's immigration policies. And of course, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is supposedly a nice conservative evangelical, she kind of backed that up. And Twitter right now and Facebook are blowing up. As I say, as I'm doing this podcast recording, it's blowing up with a lot of people that are, first of all, decrying this use of scripture to back up or justify this immigration policy, basically separating, mothers and fathers from their children, illegal immigrants coming across the border from Mexico into America, trying to find a better life or escape horrible things in South America or Mexico. And we're turning them away. In fact, detaining them in basically what amounts to concentration camps. And now they're actually using the Bible to justify and to back up that. And so what's happening now is the church in America is taking yet another black eye. And yet these are the people that 81% of white evangelical voters, that base who voted for and continue to support Donald Trump. So when you look at these kind of things that are happening, you think, okay, as I've said this many times before, where's this all going? Where's this all heading? There's a lot of troubling signs ahead, certainly for the evangelical church in not just America, but North America as well. As we heard both from Stacey Ray and Sam Morse from Canada recently, they grew up in actually a shockingly similar kind of evangelical culture. And even Josh de Keyser, who's from the Netherlands, who was a guest a few weeks ago, he described growing up in the Netherlands, of all places, influenced by American evangelicalism. And then when he went across to the States, of course, he talked about how he sort of deconstructed his own faith when he was at seminary. So a lot of different things happen to a lot of different people who are coming out of evangelicalism, fundamentalism. So where are you heading? Where are you going? I'm interested to hear your thoughts, your comments, your feedback as well. You can follow me on Twitter. Probably the best way to get a hold of me is at Mindshift2018. You can follow me on Twitter. And of course, I'll have all my other contact information in the show notes. So I want to hear what you have to say. Give me your thoughts, feedback. You can also, if you would do me a favor, leave me a review at iTunes on the Mindshift podcast page on iTunes or on Podbean. If you're a follower on Android devices, you can subscribe to Mindshift on Podbean as well. So let me know what your thoughts, your feedback, your comments. You can send me an email. You can follow me on Twitter. You can get on my Facebook page. There's a whole variety of different ways that you can get a hold of me. In fact, one of the things I like to do, I like to talk with people who are followers of the show. So if you want to chat with me, let me know. Give me a message. We'll do a Facebook or a Skype call. And who knows, you might even end up on this podcast if I think your story is interesting enough. You just never know. I talk to real, normal people from everyday walks of life. So you can end up right here on this show, or at the very least get a shout out for letting me know what your thoughts and comments and feedback are. All right, so let's go on into part 1 with Brian Staples, One Man's Journey of Deconstructing Evangelical Christianity, part 1. I'm happy to be joined by Brian Staples. We are sitting in a house in downtown Tacoma, Washington. I want to say hi to everybody, Brian.
Hey, guys.
This is great. We met at Bible college, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Do we want to know how far back that was?
I don't even want to think about how far back that was.
Let's just say it was in the early 90s.
It was in the early to mid-90s.
Yes, we went to Bible college. We won't name the place, but it was in Portland in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
You were a year ahead of me.
Yep.
We have a mutual friend named John. We'll just
Yep.
leave it at that. You were his RA, which is a resident advisor, right?
I was his RA, but we were kind of friends before that because he was living in another house where I was living in the dorms at the time.
Yeah, so you went off to Bible college, and we'll get into that, I think, in a little bit about how you ended up there. I'm really interested to hear your story because we've had 2 Evangelical meetups while I've been in Seattle, these 2 trips, and it's been really good. We heard a little bit of your story at the first meeting, and I was astounded to hear how you were raised and all that. I'm really interested. And then obviously we'll get into how you went to Bible college and what you're doing now, where you're at now. So where were you raised? What's your story? What's your backstory?
I was born in California, liberal area down there, San Jose. And my parents were Christian. They lived and breathed Bible. But it wasn't this real legalistic thing. The only big thing that I remember as a kid was that my parents really loosely followed the Bible food laws, I should say. So I wasn't allowed to eat pork, and I wasn't allowed to eat shellfish.
I don't understand that. I mean,
Yeah,
seriously,
weird.
Why? Because they weren't clearly Jewish,
No.
like Orthodox Jewish,
No.
which would make sense.
No.
So they're following the Old Testament food purity laws.
Yep.
What was the theological justification for that? Or did you know? Do you just accept it as normal growing up?
I pretty much accepted it as normal. Thinking back on it now, my dad always viewed us as being the true Israelites. He didn't see the current day Jews as being Israelites. He saw us as being Israelites.
White Americans.
White Americans.
Evangelical Christian types. You're the
Yep.
new Israel. So obviously we don't want to trace all that history, but it's got to go back to some sort of tie in with the Puritans, because they saw themselves when they came over from Europe and Britain as the new Israel, and
Yeah.
America was the promised land, and they had a covenant with God and all the rest of it, which is still very much resonates in American culture and politics and religion today.
Yes.
We're God's chosen nation and blah blah blah. So that explains a lot of the religious right in some ways, doesn't it?
Yep.
But so you're raised in this culture of food purity laws.
Yep.
But your dad was also, you were sharing, he was kind of into sort of white supremacy as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
So how does that tie in?
I didn't see a lot of it when we were living in California. Once we moved up to Oregon when I was like 7, 8 years old. It was when my sister and I were first introduced to church. My parents didn't actually go to any of the churches there. They were associated with a particular church in Olympia, Washington, and that was the only church that they were associated with. My dad was actually ordained as a minister in that church.
And that was the only true church.
That was the only true church. There was
Yes,
another
it
one
was.
in Spokane somewhere, but it's what they followed what they called the kingdom message.
So Brian, what is this kingdom message that this church was a part of?
It was basically, as we stated earlier, they viewed the white American as being the true Israelite.
Right.
That we were the ones to be saved, and we were
The only ones that were saved.
the only ones who were saved.
So what was your view, what was their view of other churches? Because you were saying the other day, every Sunday you would drive for miles to go to this one true church in Olympia. You must have passed 100 churches on the way there.
Yep.
What were they not the true church?
They didn't really, especially as far as my sister and I were concerned, they didn't really make that claim with us personally. Because I know that as my sister got toward her senior year of high school, she actually went to a conservative Baptist church locally. And I followed her to the same church a couple years later. I think I was about 20 when I first started there.
So how did that tie into the white supremacy angle, though? Because I could see that the true Israel Jews are not really Jews. Is that how it kind of fed into the white supremacy, Aryan nations kind of stuff? Or did it go that far?
I don't know exactly where my dad started picking up. I remember certain things through my childhood. I remember when we were living in Oregon. I remember finding tapes.
What was the guy's name?
Richard
Butler.
Richard Butler and his right-hand man, David.
Yeah, David. We can't remember his last name.
I can't remember his last name right offhand.
But you got Rich. Yeah, so he's a sort of a Christian-y white supremacist.
Yeah.
You found these tapes in the basement. You even listened to them.
I even listened to them, pretending, as a little kid, I was pretending I'm in a church.
You're in a church. How did you avoid not becoming a white supremacist yourself? Because a lot of kids growing up in that context would have just taken that message on board. This is the truth.
I think in some ways I actually did kind of start gaining a little bit of that mentality. The big thing was that the areas where we lived really weren't exposed a lot to other minorities, such as blacks, Asians. We weren't really exposed to those.
So it was a white suburb sort of thing.
It was a white suburbs type thing.
So yeah, you have you're in this kind of a white bubble in a way.
Yeah.
So you're in this weird kind of cult. Would you describe it now as a cult or cult-like?
Kind of cult-like. I don't know how much of it my mom actually held on to. All of it I heard coming out of my dad, because every time he witnessed to somebody, he'd be talking about us being the true Israelites.
All right. So that was the true Israel, the true church. It's amazing to talk to people that come out of that kind of a background. Some of them are still in it, obviously. Are your parents still in it? Are they still alive?
They're actually both dead now.
Right. But were they in it right up to the very end?
My dad was.
Mom, not so much?
My mom, not so much. She was involved in church. She loved being at church. The particular church that I grew up in, it actually closed down, I think it was mid-90s, mid-to-late 90s.
The one in Olympia.
The one in Olympia.
That you drove so far to get to every Sunday.
Yeah, exactly.
You must have passed hundreds of churches.
Yep.
The apostate churches. So this is a really interesting thing. You avoided becoming a white supremacist / Christian yourself, but then you obviously went off to Bible college, which is where we met way back in the 90s. Yeah. What drove you to go to Bible college? What was your dream? Why were you there?
Well, originally, the church that going back to the church in Olympia, we didn't have a youth group. So the only youth there was my cousin, my sister, and me.
You were it.
We were
the youth group.
There was one other girl that she was in and out because she was part of a divorced family. She was there half the time. The other half of the time she wasn't. So when we graduated, she wasn't there. And so, and ironically enough, it was her stepmom her stepmom's sister ultimately married my cousin. So she became part of my family again.
Keep it in the family. Very insular church, very insulated kind of experience. Did you go to study youth ministry? Was that why you went off to Bible college?
That was my original intent. How I found this particular Bible college where we met was when I did go to the new church down in the other town, which was Auburn, which was much more local to where I lived.
In Washington State.
In Washington State. That was where I ultimately found this Bible college, and it was like, that was the college, both the youth pastor, the middle school pastor were from there. And so that's what led me to decide, you know what, I think I want to go there. I was starting to get involved with a little bit of the youth ministry, as lay ministry, and I was actually really enjoying it. So I decided, you know what?
This is the place for me. It sounds like it was a perfect fit.
Yeah, at the time I thought it was. I was starting to break away from the image of the white Christian and starting to realize that there was a whole other world.
A whole other world out there.
Yeah.
Because you ended up going down to this Bible college. I think you were mentioning something the other day. You ended up going to like a mega church, didn't you, when you were a student? So that must have been a total paradigm shift, whatever you want to call it, from going to this tiny little sort of white supremacist church.
It kind of was, except for the church that I actually transferred into in Auburn was actually also a mega church.
Ah, right. So that wasn't your first taste of a mega church.
No.
But it must have been a weird transition going from a very small, insular type of church, especially with some interesting theology. What I'm curious is, when you went off to Bible college, did you ever find that you were coming out with some of the remnants of your old theological stuff from time to time, your background in this sort of white supremacist church?
Some of it, a little bit. I had wrestled with it. Most of it I wrestled with prior to going there. A lot of the friends that I had developed when I was going to this new church started talking about certain things. I'm like, that doesn't make sense.
That's not right.
And they started challenging me with this, and it's like, wait a minute, now this is making a little bit more sense. It doesn't say what I'm talking about.
Right. So you jettisoned some of that old crap that you had.
Started jettisoning it. So
now your dream was to go to Bible college. You were going to be a youth minister. Mm-hmm. Did that end up working out the way you had dreamed when you left this Bible college?
Nope.
No. Short answer, no.
Short answer, no. I actually went 4 years because the particular Bible college at the time didn't have all the general ed classes. So I completed off all my requirements, but I was a few credits short of, with these general ed classes, credits short of getting my actual bachelor's.
Your whole degree. Yeah, same thing happened to me.
Yeah. So I actually wound up with my associates, but I don't have my bachelor's.
So you're a few credits short. So what happened then? Did you didn't get into ministry, or where did you go after you left this Bible college?
Graduated, and within a matter of a couple of days, I was getting calls. I'd been already doing temp work during the summer times when I was back home, working for a rental car company, and they decided they were going to give me a call, and they wanted to hire me on full time because they liked my work, and so that's what I've actually been doing ever since.
Right. So you've been working at a rental car company, but now you describe yourself as an ex-evangelical. What happened in those intervening? It wasn't the rental car company that messed you up, was it?
No. Actually,
they're responsible for your deconstruction, Brian. That's what it is.
Yeah. Actually, I met my wife my last year of Bible college, and both of us, we got married a year after I graduated, and both of us were Christian. Obviously, we met at Bible college.
Yeah, obviously.
Great
place to meet.
She was very much steeped in the evangelical life.
Yeah, that culture.
And as we got further along in our marriage, as most couples typically struggle through a lot of their stuff, she started questioning a little bit.
So she was questioning, but you weren't necessarily questioning some of the stuff.
Correct. I actually, as we started struggling our marriage, she started questioning stuff, and I actually thought that I was the bad guy. I'm the one that's in this horrible place that is non-Christian.
Right.
So
she's
I started
losing her faith in a way, and you weren't at the time.
I wasn't. I decided I was going to dive further into my faith.
Right. So you doubled down in a sense.
I doubled down, and which it actually made things a lot worse.
Oh yes, it would.
It wasn't until probably the last probably 3-4 years she decided she was going to go for her teaching degree, and she actually went to one of the major universities, Christian universities, and she was starting to be exposed to a lot of stuff that she's like, I don't agree with this.
Right. What kind of things that was questioning her faith, or was it stuff that the university was spouting that she was going, I'm not buying this?
It was a lot of the stuff that the university was spouting that she wasn't buying. And especially when the election started coming around, they actually fully jumped behind Trump. And she
didn't go to Liberty University, obviously.
Yeah,
that place.
She did.
Oh, she did?
She did.
I was kidding.
Yeah.
She went to Liberty.
It was Liberty University. She went to the online program there.
I couldn't think of any more Christian, air quotes, university that was more Trump supporting than Liberty.
Yep.
In fact, people started returning their diplomas after he got elected because of Jerry Falwell Jr.'s just full-throated support.
Yep.
He spoke at Liberty, and he's still behind him, Falwell Jr.
Yep.
Still totally behind him. So yeah, she's seeing the political side, the religious side. Of course, it's a very conservative school,
extremely
if not fundamentalist school.
Yes.
But weirdly, so there's a lot of things going on that she's questioning, but you were doubling down at the same time.
At that time was when I was starting to question a little bit. A lot of what was starting to shake my faith was that I had been involved in a couple of car accidents, which would really kind of messed up my back. The worst of was about just over 2 years ago, which actually knocked me out of work. And it really started knocking my faith because it's like, okay, one, everybody's praying for me, so-called. But I'm not getting any better. And I also started realizing some of the political aspects of it that were affecting the outcome of this, because I was battling insurance. Obviously, my income was at a minimal. Luckily, I did have some income coming in from short-term disability benefits from work.
But there's not a lot out there, really.
Exactly.
If you're struggling. Well, we're the house we're sitting in right now doing this recording is from my friend Jeff. In fact, him and his wife Karen were on this podcast a year ago talking about his battle with leukemia, and we're helping him, volunteering to help them finish their bathroom so they have to sell their house because they have no money to pay for his treatment. So there's not a lot of safety nets, unfortunately, in this country for people that are seriously injured, or even, you weren't seriously injured, but you were bad enough that you couldn't work. Where do you go from there? So you're now starting to deconstruct things, because that's the thing, isn't it? You go, wait a minute. I mean, why would this God lay these burdens on me and not heal me, and yet expects me to love me? I was talking about this the other day with somebody, and I said, it's weird. I can't imagine if you were a parent and your child came to you and you took a knife and you sliced her arm open. You gave her this terrible wound and then bandaged her up and helped her heal and then said, I want you to love me because I not only cut you and I terribly hurt you, but now I'm healing you. You want that child to love you. That's kind of what God's doing in a way. If this is the view we're taking, He's not only laying these diseases and accidents and injuries on us, He wants us to love Him even though He may not heal us. Yeah. So it's a crazy view of God in there somehow.
Exactly. Well, it also affected how I viewed the church. The church that I had been attending, which is a different church now, because since graduating, we had moved out of the area. We're living in a wonderful town called Gig Harbor, Washington. And we had been attending a church there. And as I was going through a lot of these struggles, a lot of the people were there, they're like, oh, whatever. But we're not going to help you out. All we're going to do is just pray for you.
We'll pray for you.
It's like,
thoughts and prayers.
Not what I want. I actually need some moral help. I actually started diving pretty deep into depression during this whole period of time.
You're struggling in a lot of ways, financially, physically, emotionally. Where's God in this? Where's the church in this? I mean, again, going back to where we're sitting right now doing this recording, the people from the church that Jeff and Karen used to be a part of, they're nowhere to be found. Yeah. The people who need help of every possible variety, physical, monetary, people working on their house, mowing the lawn. No Christians have come around. No church. There's loads of churches in this area. There's a church I could throw a stone and hit it from here, and there's nobody that's here to help from those churches. So where are they? Why aren't they helping? So yeah, it's unbelievable. So you're struggling. You're deconstructing. Now your wife is looking at you saying, "Well, finally, Brian, you started to come around here." Yeah. So you're kind of going through this together. Where would you describe yourself now? What's your views sort of evolved into now?
I would definitely say that I'm at a point right now that I'm very affirming for the LGBTQ.
Hard one to pronounce all that. Yeah. Whereas you weren't before.
Exactly.
That's a big shift.
Before it was more of that, okay, love the sinner, hate the sin type mindset. Well, I started realizing that you can't really do the two.
It's just a platitude that I think a lot of Christians spout, but it actually, they actually don't love the sinner either. By their actions, they actually hate the sin and they hate the sinner. Yep. They don't have any gay friends. They don't know anybody who's gay. Yep. There's a gay pride parade. They're probably going to be down there picketing it or standing there praying for it. Yep. So they're not really that open to it, even though they claim to be loving the sinner. They're praying for them to get straight and get saved. That's about as far as they'll go with it. So yeah, that's a big shift in that regard, isn't it? What's your views on God? How would you say those have changed?
I still believe that there's God's there. As far as
you haven't gone the atheist route.
I have not gone the atheist route. As far as being personally involved with my life, it's still up for debate there.
Can you point to any specific things in your life where you could say that was God? No doubt about it. No question about it. It's hard to say, isn't it?
It is hard to say.
When you look back on it, you really wonder, all those prayers that we sat and prayed and prayed and prayed, were they really answered? I don't know. I don't know if what you think about that. We obviously spent hours. I mean, at our Bible college, they used to make us do concerts of prayer where we'd spend hours and hours in chapel and worshiping and praying and all this stuff. Were there any tangible, demonstrable answers? I don't know. Some would say there is, but I don't know.
Some would say there is. I personally really never saw them.
Yeah, it's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, do you know anyone who was healed? I don't know. That's another issue, isn't it? There are people that have been claimed that they've been healed miraculously, and it could only have been a divine intervention. I don't know. It's hard to say. Yeah, I'm kind of an agnostic in that regard too. I don't know. Yeah. I'm not prepared to say there is no God, but by saying that actually makes a lot of sense in some ways, especially in the problem of evil. Yeah. If you just say, look, there's no God. Evil happens, storms, fires, floods. It just happens. It's our world, and God isn't causing it. He's not behind it. Because that's a lot of the issues that people have with God is why didn't He stop it? Why didn't He? If He's all powerful, blah blah blah, or why didn't He stop the latest mass shooting? Or He could. Yeah, you got to question all these things, but it takes you in a lot of weird places that
it really does.
People are uncomfortable with.
Yeah,
evangelicals anyway.
Yeah, and that's where I'm kind of separating myself from that aspect of thinking about God involved with that, where I keep thinking about the human aspect of all of that.
I have no idea where you're at in terms of your own spiritual journey. I'm just here as a fellow traveler along this road of deconstruction and discovery, wherever you're coming from. Maybe you're like myself and Brian, and a lot of the things that we talked about in this episode, part 1, you can identify with. Where did you come from? What's your backstory? Did you come out of fundamentalism? Did you come out of evangelicalism? Maybe even like Brian, you grew up in a church that preached some bizarre form of white supremacy. And it's amazing how this is all somehow tied into a biblical worldview. I can't imagine growing up in a home where my dad was basically subscribing to these sort of white supremacist views and somehow tying the Bible into all of that to justify all of these bizarre things, all this stuff about whites being the true Israels in America and all the rest of it, and how Brian didn't end up becoming completely warped and twisted and, one of those kind of guys himself. It's actually a pretty miraculous story that even within his evangelical discoveries and journey, he didn't, go into that himself. And now he's talked about his escaping all that, getting out of this, deconstructing. And luckily for him, it was actually his wife that kind of started him along that path, even though he was doubling down. And we're going to get a bit more into that next week and talk about some of those very specific things. What does it look like in terms of politics and religion and all the things that you're surrounded by in this American evangelical, almost a subculture, but it's actually more than a subculture. It is the culture. America is a Christian nation, as they're very fond of pointing out, whatever that means. And this is all part and parcel of the American experience. And it's been strange for me flying back and forth to the States, coming back home to Britain and being here in a much more secularized kind of environment. And we've realized, talking to my wife as I've been going back and forth, we've said, we're very fortunate that we're over here in the United Kingdom, because what it's actually afforded us is, and we've come to realize this over the last several years, it's afforded us or allowed us a place of safety, really, to deconstruct our own Christian views. About 10 years ago, we walked away from the church we were involved in. And ever since then, we haven't had family members. We haven't had friends that have come against us and, ripped us to pieces like so many people have in North America. Friends and family members who are still very much involved in the evangelical culture. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are in the process of walking away from their Christian faith who still have friends and family members who are very much involved in that culture. And they can be very cruel and very harsh and kind of trolling them on Facebook and Twitter and other places when they start talking about what they believe now or what they don't believe in anymore. So I don't know where you're at, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and comments and feedback. If anything that Brian and I talked about kind of made you think, okay, here's where I'm at. I want to talk to somebody else. I want to get connected in a community of supporting people who are going through a lot of the same kind of things as I am. So let me know what you think. You can, as I say, follow me on Twitter at Mindshift2018. I want to hear from you. You can also get a hold of Brian Staples on Facebook and other places. If you message me, I will put you in touch with Brian. So join me next week for part 2 of this story of one man's deconstruction of evangelical Christianity, one man's journey of walking away from the faith, and what does it look like? And we're going to get into some specifics on politics and religion, and then get into areas of what can you do? Where can you go? What advice does Brian have for you? So come back next Friday for part 2 with me and Brian Staples right here on Mindshift Podcast.
Yes,